Hey guys, Matthew, and welcome to episode number 4 of the Casual Exile series. Today I have a massive video for you guys, so I'm just going to get straight into it. Today we are talking about all of the league mechanics. Now there's a lot to talk about, and as always there's going to be the link in the description of the video for the actual document. But as you can see, I have written quite a bit about every single one of these league mechanics. So what I want to do in this video, so we don't actually stay here for over an hour, is I'll be telling you guys basically what the league mechanic is, if I interact with it, like in my early mapping, if I interact with it in the end game, and then if I have anything else to add. So that way we can just go from one to the next without spending too much time. If you want additional information or even some strategies, I have some listed in the actual document, so feel free to check that out. All right, so Anarchies, Rogue Exiles, you're pretty much always going to interact with this one because it's always in the game. Rogue Exiles are nice because they always drop a full set of gear, which means Chaos Recipe early game, but otherwise, I mean, you're always going to interact with them. Nemesis, something you, again, will always interact with as it can be randomly rolled on your map device. Now, Nemesis in the end game is pretty much the best thing you can have if it's available on the map device. Now, I have a video here from Harvest League where I was farming some Giga Juice maps, and I dropped 3 Headhunters in a single map as a solo player with no quantity or magic find gear whatsoever. So Nemesis is the absolute end game of GG farming when it's available. Also, what you're going to use for things like Ancient Orbing Headhunters or like Gambling Headhunters and stuff like that. Domination is Shrines, again, something you'll encounter at any point in the game. You're probably going to do them, right? It's just a nice little bonus, and there's no real danger there. Ambush is a Strongbox mod. Now, Ambush actually has some really cool interactions with the new Atlas tree, which actually I have this this forum post here with this guy who farmed a Headhunter in 3 days using the Monstrous Treasure Prophecy paired up with the new Ambush on the Glennick Carnes region of the Atlas. So you can read up that. The link is going to be in the description as well. Otherwise, I pretty much always open strong boxes. There's no reason not to. There's just additional loot in there. Early game, end game, doesn't matter. Invasion has not been part of the core game. It's been added on some places in the new Atlas tree, but it honestly sucks, so I just ignore it altogether. Rampage is kind of the same thing. You can get it through different unique items, but the league itself you're not going to encounter, so it doesn't matter. Beyond is basically the juicer of all juicers. This is what's going to literally push your maps to a whole other level in the end game. That being said, in the early game and the early Atlas progression, I completely ignore Beyond. I don't even want to interact with it at all because it's just going to get me killed. Beyond bosses are insanely strong early game. So even if you have Beyond on your map early game, in your actual Atlas progression, what I do is I clear my map like regularly, and anytime I get some Beyond rare monsters or even some Beyond bosses to spawn, I actually run away from them. I don't clear them at all. They're just not worth the time. They don't drop anything valuable, and overall they're just not worth it at all. All right, next we have Bloodlines. Now Bloodlines is again something you'll just encounter randomly. You're not really going to force this in any way. So yeah, it's just something that sometimes you'll have on your map device. There is some stuff to do with some Sextant mods, but realistically, Bloodlines kind of sucks. The only thing is in Deep Delve, it can be annoying, but that's probably not something that applies to most of you, so nothing to write home about there. Next, we have Torment. So Torment has, again, some nice little strategy, which I've explained in here, but overall, Torment is just, for me, is just additional monsters. I pretty much always just kill the Ghost. I don't try to push him inside rares to get that loot explosion like you're supposed to do. I don't think it's worth the time whatsoever. But there is some interaction with the Seance and the Sextant modifier that drops you Scarabs, which I think is pretty interesting, which I mentioned here, which is a nice little, side bonus currency as you're rolling your regular Sextants. Next, we have Tempest. Now, Tempest also didn't really make it to the core game, so it's only available through Prophecies. So again, not something you'll encounter during your actual progression of your Atlas or anything like that. But in the end game, it's a nice way to add a little extra quantity to your maps. I have listed some strategies with Tempest as well in there, but again, since you won't encounter it, there's nothing to say there. Next, you have Warbands. Now, Warbands is sometimes on the map device, but overall, it's garbage. It doesn't really do anything. The amount of monsters that it adds is negligible, and all the uniques from it suck. So really, Warbands is just that one league, which didn't really have anything going for it, so we can go ahead and skip that out entirely. Next, we have Talisman. Now, recently, Talisman has started dropping with Anoints, but unfortunately, Talismans are always corrupted, which means no influence possible, nothing like that. So the odds of getting a good talisman with a good anoint with like actual good stats that matter, that are just not like life and res, pretty much none. So the only thing I would use talismans for is I would pick up an absolute crazy amount of them, for example, when I'm farming simulacrums and stuff and whatnot, and then I would just vendor them for alterations, yeah, whatever alterations are very, very high. Otherwise, talismans just stay on the ground, and 99% of the time they're not on my filter, because again, they're not worth it. The only ones which I would actually consider looking at twice is Spine Fuse Talisman, as they have this quantity implicit, and even just life and resistance can be very valuable to a Magic Find character if it's got a good amount of quant. So that's about it for Talisman. Not something you'll encounter because it's not part of the core game, really. Prentice is the same, not part of the core game. You're not going to encounter him unless you force him, or unless you go through the Atlas, the new Atlas skill tree, like for example Alexia Joris. But I don't think it's worth interact with Prentice whatsoever. It's just bad. So you can skip that entirely. I would highly recommend you skip it. Prophecy League, also not really part of the core game in the actual mapping portion of the game. Now, of course, it's still, you know, something which you can do. Silver coins still drop. You can always seek new prophecies and all that. But 99% of them are pretty bad, or at least 90% of them are pretty bad. Now, there is some juicing prophecies, such as Tempests and Plagues. The only issue is that they don't have a very good chance of actually proccing whenever you run a map, so they're not super consistent. So I'm not a fan of this league mechanic whatsoever. That being said, I will actually interact with it in the very end game for juicing my maps, because even if it's a smaller chance, any amount of extra monsters on your map when it comes to the very end game is worth it. That being said, I do have a video about Faded Uniques, which I highly recommend you check it out. It's a good way to get going in a new league. Either if you're starting a league late or even in a brand new league, it's a good way to get going in terms of currency, which basically very, very low investment with some okay returns. So highly recommend you check that video out. I've been told many times by people who have used this strategy that it completely changed their league start and how successful they are with it. So check that out if you feel like it. Next, we have Essence. Now, Essence is just part of the core game. You kill the Essences. I never really interact with the whole Remnant of Corruption upgrading Essence mechanic. I think it's like whatever. So nothing to say there. Now, Breach League used to be one of everybody's favorite league, basically, but it's been nerfed so many times to the point where it's not super great anymore. I will actually not interact with any of the Breach mechanic during my Atlas progression, since typically the amount of juice in my maps will make it so the Breach monsters don't really drop anything. So I will start interacting with Breach in like low tier red maps when I'm actually heading towards the end game. So yeah, white maps, yellow maps, pretty much ignore all breaches, because Chiyula is the one that's really worth a lot, especially just Chiyula Splinters, well, typically anyways, but there's not a good chance of getting Chiyula in low tier maps. Chiyula has a much higher chance to actually show up in higher tier maps, which is why I ignore Breach in the lower tier mapping, especially because, like I said, it's not a very rewarding league mechanic, and not only that, it actually takes a lot of time, which you could just be running the next map instead, which is going to progress your Atlas to get to the end game faster. That being said, in terms of actually farming Breach Stones, I have to give a huge shout out to PoE Profit, website that was made by Grimro and powered by PoE Ninja. Now, this will actually allow you to see whether Breach Stone farming and also other methods of farming are actually profitable, such as Bosses, Guardians. Again, link in the description. Shout out to Grimro for his work on that. All right, next we have Harbinger League. Harbinger, basically, you're not going to encounter whatsoever in the regular game because it's not part of the core game. There's many ways to actually force on Harbinger in your maps. There's Sextant mods, there's the new Atlas tree, and there's also Scarabs, which is probably the preferred method, because it's really good in the end game. Also, same thing with Breach, which I forgot to mention. Very good end game mechanic when it comes to full juicing, because once you get enough like quantity and pack size in your maps, those Breach actually start to add up to a lot of extra reward tiles. Could be the difference between a 12 reward tile and a 14 reward tile in a map. So definitely very good in the end game, and the Scarabs are actually very cheap for Breach, even the higher tier one, polished, typically like 1 chaos each in bulk. All right, so same thing with Harbinger, very cheap scarabs, adds a lot to your maps in the end game. Now there is a new strategy that basically showed up within the Valdos region with the diplomatic escort node, something I've mentioned in the document, which you can check that out. But for the video, I'm not going to talk about that. All right, next we have Abyss League. Abyss pretty much sucks. It's been made more and more and more irrelevant every single time they add a new league. There's more and more ways of actually getting Stygian Vises in the game now. Almost every single league mechanic feels like they throw Stygian Vises at you. But not only that, Cluster Jewels have basically replaced Abyss Jewels entirely. There's not really so much that you want on an Abyss Jewel, except if you want like a phasing one or an onslaught on kill. That's about the only use for Abyss Jewels nowadays. They're just not worth it. So not only that, Abyss can actually go backwards in your map, and in that case I would recommend you never ever do them. I typically skip every single Abyss almost in the entire game, unless the Abyss is going in the same direction that I'm going towards, further in the map, and I will never ever do an Abyssal Depth, and I won't even stop for that long for these additional Abyss. Like I said, maybe in the very end game, because it does add a fair bit of additional monsters to my map, but if it's going backwards, I never do it, and when it comes to Abyssal Depths, I never do them, because the unique items, even the 2-socket ones, are pretty much worthless at this point in time. So Abyss, which used to be pretty decent back when Abyss Jewels were very, very good, now that they've been nerfed significantly and Cluster Jewels are new king, yeah, pretty much a hard skip for me. Next, we have Bestiary. Now, Bestiary is something you'll just encounter in the normal game, of course, so it's not a question of whether you do it or not. You'll pretty much always do it. It's just additional monsters to your map, and it's for free. That being said, there is a strategy which can net you some insane amounts of currency. That being said, it's a bit of a gray area, but I have already made a video about this, which will be linked. A community member of mine made 4 mirrors in 2 weeks as a solo player with this strategy, so definitely something you want to look out for if you're somebody who doesn't mind doing some more risky stuff. That being said, like risky, gray area, do it at your own risk. You've been warned. All right, next we have the Incursion League. Now, the Incursion League has a lot that goes into it, but I will pretty much always skip it entirely in the early stage of a league. Now, the reason for that is quite simple. In the early stage of a league, pack size, quantity, rarity is not so great, so you won't get that much of a loot explosion as you would in the end game. Also, incursions are pretty long, and sometimes in some leagues are actually prone to crashing you. And crashing and going back to a queue in the initial stage of a league, like at the league start, it's not something I want to happen, so I typically will hard skip every single legion until I get to red maps. Same thing with breaches, right? The reason for that, they're too long, they don't really reward you with anything whatsoever, and they're pretty rare. So the thing is, you would think that, you'd want to complete your temple or whatever, but if you're actually rushing through the Atlas, by the time that you reach red maps, you probably won't even have a single temple actually completed and ready to run. So I rather ignore it entirely. And then once I get to those red maps, this is where I'll actually start using my legions. That being said, not Legion, Incursions. That being said, Incursions are actually a decent way to get some map sustain. So as you're going through the higher tier of whatever map color you're running, so for example, if you're running white maps and now you're in T4s, T5s, trying to drop some T6s, might as well throw Alva, because you're not going to be coming back for white Alvas ever, so might as well use your daily master missions to try to increase your odds of going up in map tiers and progressing faster. Otherwise, in terms of trying to do the Alva temples for profit or something, forcing her on my maps, definitely not something I would do in the early stage of a league. That being said, as you can see, I've actually written quite a bit about this league mechanic, so I highly recommend you read that through. There's definitely some things that can net you some profit. Delve is basically a side game. It's not really part of the main game whatsoever, and I don't think you should delve at all outside of the early stage of a league when it comes to getting those jewelry pieces for the chaos recipe. Outside of that, I don't think it's worth to ever touch delve if you're going to be half-assing it, because there's no money there whatsoever. That being said, again, if your plan is to actually go super hard on delve and become a deep delver, there is some pretty insane amounts of currency to be made. I've made a quick series of 3 videos about delving and everything to do with it, as from the basics, the builds required, the playstyle, etc. Nice little 3 video series. You can check that out if you're interested in learning to delve. I myself got to 6k depth last league, and I can tell you that it's some absolute insane amounts of currency that can be made. Of course, the price of Fractured Fossil is going to account for a lot of that, but in all cases, it's always really, really good to delve. It's always good currency. But again, not something you can half-ass, something you need to dedicate a lot of time to learn and to get good at. Okay, next we have Betrayal League. Betrayal League is something I actually ignore entirely in the game. I don't think that's what you should do, though. I really think that learning Betrayal and how it works is definitely something that can net you a lot of profit, especially in the early stage of a league. What I would recommend, if you want to really, sit down and learn everything to do with the Betrayal Guide, is to check out Cute Dog. Shout out to him. Cute Dog's Betrayal Guide. Essentially what this guide is, because it's like 2 hour long, it's like watching an old movie. Back when movies weren't 45 minutes long. It's a step-by-step guide. He takes you from a blank betrayal board all the way to completed endgame betrayal board with all of the different links that you need to do and how you're going to actually get to that point. It's an insanely good guide, and I've watched it myself, but I just actually don't like to interact with the betrayal mechanic, which is why I literally ignore it entirely. That being said, again, got some nice little strategies that I added as part of the guide, so you can totally read that on your own. All right, next we have Synthesis League. Synthesis was not part of the core game, but GGG has added multiple places where you can actually get some synthesized items for things like explodey, bows and wands and all that cool stuff. Something that I've added some stuff in terms of strategies in the guide, but realistically, Synthesis is not something you'll encounter ever, so you don't have to worry about it. Next we have Legion. Legion is also a mechanic that I will hard skip during the leveling and Atlas progression stage because, quite frankly, you won't have enough damage or enough clear, or either of them, to actually get a good clear on a Legion to make it worth clearing in the early stage of a league, unless you're playing an incredibly clear speed heavy build, such as Essentia and Contagion. Otherwise, it's just not going to be worth it trying to chase those guards that actually have some rewards to them. Not worth it. I will highly recommend you skip Legion entirely until you get to red maps. This is where your characters are going to start really picking up in terms of speed, in terms of damage, in terms of clear. And that's when farming Legion becomes much more valuable. Now, I've added quite a bit when it comes to Legion League. There's a lot that goes into this. There's the whole strategy in New Vastier where you can farm emblems for crazy cheap. There's a whole 4-way and 5-way, like unlocking your 5-way map device. There's a lot that goes into this league mechanic, essentially, so I'd highly recommend, if you want to learn, to check out what I've written there. Next, we have Blight League. Blight League, again, something you'll get sometimes, 10% chance or whatever. I pretty much skip Blight maps, I pretty much skip Blight encounters in my early stages, but I will actually start interacting with them even as early as yellow maps, because in yellow maps, I mean, not that it's different in white maps, but in yellow maps, you can start dropping yellow blighted maps, of course, and those are typically worth quite a bit, even very early on. The reason I tend to skip blights like super early is that a lot of the time they don't really give you anything. Even if there's an ability to get some white blighted maps, which are actually quite decent in terms of value, it really doesn't drop anything else that's valuable for the actual amount of time that you need to invest to finish a complete blight encounter. Not only that, if your build struggles with damage or with clear speed, you can actually fail it like a lot. Which is why I start to interact with it when my character feels a little bit more strong and when I have a little bit more investment into it, which is typically going to be in like those yellow, high yellow, or even sometimes in red tier, depending on the build that I'm playing. But in the end game, it's an absolute amazing mechanic. You should always interact with blight. Those red blighted maps are worth a lot. Now, not so much in this current league, but still definitely worth doing. You can always get those golden oils too in those high tier red maps and stuff. So definitely something that I interact with. And in the very end game, blight is actually one of the best mechanic in terms of adding extra reward tiles to your Delirium maps. So something to note there as well. All right, Metamorph, pretty much hard skip for me. Metamorph in the early stage in the progression part of the game, I will hard skip Metamorph. The reason for that is that a lot of the time the rewards are just not worth how hard these are. They're overtuned as hell. I will hard skip Metamorphs in white maps, in yellow maps, and even in early red maps. I will only start interacting with Metamorph in the very end game when my character is like a beast, right? That's the point where I can start just one-shotting or two-shotting them. That's when I start interacting with Metamorph. Anyways, the better catalysts, the ones that actually have any sort of real value, are not really going to drop in the early stages of mapping. So hard skip Metamorph for me. I'll start interacting with it later. Next, we have Delirium. Delirium is something that I'll pretty much always actually do. So what I'll do for Delirium Mirror is that I will actually go in it, right? I'll start the mirror, and then I'll progress my map as normal until I get to the point where those rare monsters or whatever are starting to feel like I'm not able to one-shot them anymore, like I'm actually struggling to kill them, or that I'm in any sort of danger, and then I'm just going to end the actual mechanic, because first off, the way that you get rewards from Delirium is to kill more monsters in the fog. But the other thing is that you need to travel. The further you travel in the fog, the more Delirium Splinters you get. Now, these are two things that don't really add up in the early stage of maps, because a lot of the maps don't have good layouts, so the fog kind of dissipates in the wrong side and all that, but also because there's not that many monsters in your maps either way. So I would pretty much just use it as a nice little stepping stone to add a little bit of extra loot whenever it does spawn. And of course, there's always going to be some cluster jewels, even low item level bases, which can fetch a few chaos, which is nice early. But Delirium is clearly the Giga Juicer paired with Beyond when it comes to the truly end game. So always do it, but don't really get anything out of it until much later in the game. Again, I've added some extra stuff here. Next, we have Harvest. Harvest is the one mechanic that I will always do. Even in T1 maps, I will do Harvest if I happen to find one, because even the low item level crafts will pretty much always fetch some sort of currency or be useful for myself. Now, I've added some additional information, such as, you know, what to prioritize, what to save, what not to save. Having only 10 maximum saved craft is not a lot. So you definitely need to be a little bit careful, unless you're going to be, you know, instantly selling them the moment you get any of them. But yeah, Harvest is definitely one of the mechanics that you never, ever want to skip, even if some of the Harvest monsters are actually really overtuned and they're very hard to deal with earlier on this in your character stage. I still think that it's worth it to struggle through it, in case you get something like a remove add life or like an augment influence or whatever it is. Really, it's always going to be worth it, unlike some of these other mechanics, because even if it's a gamble and some of these crafts are really rare, it doesn't matter, because the actual payout whenever you get even just a single one pays off way more than these other Lee mechanics that I told you guys that I would personally skip. Next, we have Heist. Now, I don't interact with Heist. I pretty much skipped Heist during the Heist League. I didn't really do more than 2 days of it. I thought it was boring as hell. So you could definitely check out some YouTube as forum guides, maybe Reddit, to learn about Heist and whether it's good or not. But for me, Heist is a hard skip. I will never interact with it. I don't even really pick up contracts or markers for that matter in the end game. Maybe in the early game, because you can sell them to other people. I'm not sure. But realistically, for me, Heist is a hard skip. And finally, we have the Ritual League. Now, the Ritual League, quite frankly, doesn't do a whole lot in the very end game, especially because the amount of the monsters that get spawned from the Ritual do not count towards Delirious reward tiles, which kind of sucks. If it did, it would be an absolute crazy League mechanic, which is why probably they made sure it didn't. But the monsters that spawn from killing the monsters in the Ritual, such as, for example, if you have Beyond, those are going to count, which is why I even interact with it whatsoever. Otherwise, if ever Ritual was to go core, which I don't think it will, because it doesn't add anything to the game other than just kill monsters, and those leagues typically will not get added to the actual core game. But if it was to be added to the core game, I would probably skip it. The reason why I would skip it until the very end game, so for example, these T16 or Delirious maps and stuff like that, is quite simple. It takes way too much time for the rewards. Now, I know that a lot of you guys probably got tabulas from it, and you're like, what the heck, dude? I got a tabula on the first day of a league, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but if you got a tabula, let's say in Act 3 or something, and you did it for the whole 10 acts in every single zone and whatnot, the amount of time that you spend doing these rituals is significantly longer than the amount of time you were required to just do the chaos recipe to just buy a tabula from someone else. And actually progress to the end game much, much faster. So I actually interacted this league with the ritual mechanic as early as T1 maps all the way up to the end game. And by the time my buddies who were not interacting with it reached the high red maps, I was actually just about to get out of yellow maps. So it hindered my progress by a ton, and I highly regretted it, even if it actually gave me 2 exalts on the first day of the league. Not worth it at all. I would get way more from just selling maps by getting to the end game faster. So Ritual for me is a hard skip until the very end game, at which point it's a very nice way to both sustain maps as it adds an insane amount of monsters to your map, but also to, you know, boost up the value of things like, for example, inspired learnings in early Delirium mapping and stuff like that. Otherwise, in even 100% Delirium maps, it's actually questionable whether it's worth it or not. Whew, a lot to say. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. This basically covers every single league mechanic from beginning to end. Now, there's a lot more to this. I highly recommend you check out the actual document, as I've written some different strategies for different ones of these league mechanics and whatnot. All the links that I've mentioned or that I've talked about in this video are both in this, but they'll be in the description of this video. Otherwise, I do want to say a huge thank you to my supporters: Johnny, Michael, Cluzy, Zarashi, Lero, Gaikona, JW Players, Scott, Justin, Alex, Ollie, Matt, Kevin, Hayden, Bitizen, and Axel, as well as, of course, anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous and anybody else who has supported me in the past. Now, the list isn't quite updated yet. I'll be doing that shortly, so if your name isn't on there, I'm very sorry. But that'll be Matthew signing out until the next one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned a little something. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.